I think what I found so interesting about my conversation with Julia that you're about to hear is that we so don't know how to deploy AI well. I mean, it just seems like, as Julia highlights, there's so many decisions that we have to make about how to design our AI models and our applications, our products. And we are so steeped in ignorance about what kinds of decisions we ought to make, or what, if you like, the best AI model is, that it's very hard to proceed. So, in technical language, as Julia says, this is the problem of model multiplicity. You've got lots of different AI models, and they all seem to be more or less equally good for the case at hand. There's not any reason to think that any one of these 10 models is more accurate or better than the other. And so the question is, well, what do we do then, given that there's so much information that we don't know which is the appropriate model to choose or which are the inappropriate ones? The other thing, and this is related, is that it's very hard to test these different models because there are so many contexts, so many use cases in which your model can be deployed. And so you can't just say, all right, well, let's just do all the testing and all the use cases. I mean, you can do that, but that's going to take a really long time, which means that there's also a scalability problem with testing AI and doing your due diligence because let's say you're dealing with a large language model for diagnostic purposes in healthcare. It's an example that I really like to talk about and go back to. There's so many different kinds of medical contexts. There are so many different kinds of people, so many different kinds of ages, ethnicity, medical backgrounds, so many different countries, so many different medications. There's just so much that how are we supposed to know if this tool is good for helping us, say, in oncology, but not in pediatrics, or oncology for this age group, but not that other one? So it makes just the conversation brings out that it's just so hard for us to do our due diligence in choosing the appropriate AI model. There is, though, I guess, is another side to the coin, which is something like, you know, we're so ignorant about the world and about exactly how our AI is going to operate in the world that it gives us a space to um, insert our values. I don't think Julia would quite put it this way. You'll hear what she says. She thinks the values come first. But there's a way in which the way that I'm thinking about it, at least in part, is we've got these various AI options, these various models that we might use. We're not sure which AI we should choose for our particular use case for a variety of reasons. But we also know that something like the accuracy of the model, how, from an engineering perspective, how good it is or how accurate it is not the only value at play. There are other values, like ethical values, the welfare of society, for instance, that can come into play to help us choose which of the models we should go with. And so, I don't know. Again, I don't think that Julie would quite put it this way. Maybe she would. I'll have to talk to her again. But there's a way in which our ignorance about how our AI is going to interact in the world or how various kinds of AI that we create will interact in the world, our ignorance leaves open this gap where our values can come into play and settle the debate for us, or at least help us to settle that debate. So that's this sort of the ignorance that we suffer from, and the way in which we can bring our values to help us choose the models when facts about how the model will work in the world run out. I thought that was a really fascinating thing that I hadn't really thought about before. So there's nothing for me to sort of highlight above and beyond that. I think it's pretty self-explanatory what goes on in our conversation. I think it's pretty easy to follow. So nothing for me to clarify, I don't think. Couple of bookkeeping things, like I always say, please, like, you listening to the podcast right now, take the phone out, go to the podcast and just review the thing. Hit the 5-star thing and say this is the best thing ever. And if you don't think it's the best thing ever, then lie. This is an ethicist telling you to lie. Also, if you've read my book, go to Amazon and please give the book a review. The algorithm really loves that. And finally, if you've got anything you want me to talk about or people you want me to talk to, reach out to me at em, as in ethical machines, em at reedblackman.com. One thing in particular that I've been sort of toying with lately is, to what extent does my audience want to hear me talk about philosophy stuff more generally, or ethics more generally? So, for instance, I could talk to you for a long time about things like whether ethics is objective or is it subjective. I could talk to you about different, theories in ethics or in political philosophy. I think that stuff is super interesting. I think there's a way in which it bears on a lot of the discussions that we're having in this podcast. although admittedly 1 or 2 levels removed from that. I'm happy to talk about that stuff if people find it interesting. So if you would like me to talk about that kind of stuff or do a handful of episodes where I sort of explain things like debates about whether ethics is objective or not, or I explain, I don't know, criticisms of libertarianism, just to give you some examples, then please send me an email at em@readblackman.com and tell me, and I will start doing that stuff. But if no one cares, I just won't do it, and we'll continue on as you've been doing. This is not instead of the conversations I've been having with people. This would be in addition to. Okay, enough about that stuff. Let's get to it. So, Julia, you've got certain views on what responsible AI means or how it ought to be implemented. So, tell us a little bit about that.
So the way that I like to think about this, just to simplify things for myself, is that we should be using AI in a way that is socially sustainable somehow, that makes society better, that helps us move forward towards our economic goals and our social goals, rather than destabilizing or amplifying, let's say, the divide in terms of opportunity among particular segments of the population. So social sustainability, to me, is what responsible AI boils down to. And I think that we should be aiming to make it so that all use of AI is responsible in a hopefully not too distant future, so that we don't have a kind of a bifurcation into examples where we use AI just somehow and those where AI is being used responsibly.
So let me, so let me push back on that a little bit. So you might think, I sort of like to think about this in terms of let's not be irresponsible. You know, if being responsible means creating positive social impact or something like good outcomes, I'm inclined to think that that's not going to fit most use cases for AI, at least not in a corporate context, which is going to be if anywhere is the primary point where AI is going to get used, it's going to be in a corporate context.
Could you give
So,
me an example of
yeah, I
where?
mean,
Yeah.
I guess, if you're thinking about using AI in HR or in marketing or in operations or in finance or just developing some tool that some consumers are going to use or clients are going to use, it's going to help your bottom line. I take it that the goals are not evil, but I wouldn't say that they're sort of, building a sustainable future or something along those lines. That feels too grand a moniker for the kind of activities that most corporations are engaged in.
So let me push back at this, right? And
Yeah.
I'm really glad that we're already having a conversation. We're not just kind of reaffirming each other's points, but that there is,
Yeah. Oh, too boring.
too boring, exactly. So, when you use AI in a corporate context, there are still multiple goals that you're going to pursue. And of course, one of these primarily is going to be about making money for the company, making things more efficient, for example, which then saves on the need to invest too much in the way of human resources, right, et cetera, et cetera. But still, it is not the only goal that we should be making money for the company that is using AI, for the shareholders of the company, or that we should be making money for the vendors of these AI solutions if they happen to be external to the company. When companies use AI in HR, for example, to help HR specialists decide whom to invite for job interviews or how to identify potential promising candidates for a position, there are going to be multiple goals there already, right? I mean, the company is going to want to hire people who will improve or at least not degrade the company culture. And they're going to want to hire people who will then go back to their communities, to their families, to say that the way that they were screened and the way that the company's work environment is set up is supportive of them, that they are not being hired simply to execute on a task, let's say, right? So already there are social impacts. And then also, social sustainability very often is in line with the business goals directly, because if you think about a company procuring software, buying software from an external vendor that presumably is helping them screen in well-qualified candidates and screen out those who are not well-qualified, then there's also an efficiency argument there that we need to support, meaning that the software being sold has to actually be proven to work to achieve these particular goals. And this is social sustainability with a small s, kind of in a local context. And this,
So,
unfortunately, is not something that we're seeing today.
okay, so if I'm a data scientist, I'm going to say something like I imagine, look, I want to optimize for accuracy. I just want to get the most accurate results I can, the most accurate ratings or risk ratings, or, the likelihood that the candidate's going to be successful here, whatever the relevant score is. I just want to maximize that. I don't have any other goal. What other goal could I possibly have other than that? I mean, are you suggesting that there are other goals other than getting the, if you like, the most accurate ratings that we can get? What happens if those goals come into conflict? Is this kind of a sub goal or a constraint? And are we talking about things like diversity? What's the other goal that we're talking about here?
Yeah, we should talk about diversity maybe a little bit later, but even just to drill in on this goal of accuracy, right?
Yeah.
Accuracy itself is not a monolithic concept. When you say that you want your predictor, and this is a predictor of how well somebody will do on the job,
Yeah.
to be accurate, you have to accept that there will be mistakes that it makes, right? Because it's not possible for us to predict the future unless we create it directly.
Sure, all the time.
Right. And not only are there bad hires all the time, but also very often we miss out on hiring candidates who would have been really good, right? And so
Sure.
this
Yep.
is what I want to
Yeah.
drill in on is if you quantify your accuracy as simply just how many mistakes does the predictor make by either hiring people who are not well qualified or not hiring people who are well qualified, right? You already are compounding two types of error here. These are false positives and false negatives. So false
Sure.
positives are people you hire whom you shouldn't have hired. False negatives are people you didn't hire whom you should have hired.
Yep.
And if you think about this, if your goal was to make sure that your false positives are low, that you don't hire anybody who doesn't do well, then you shouldn't hire anybody, period, right? That guarantees for you
Sure.
that you don't
That
have any false
it's a way
positives.
to eliminate that risk. Yep.
Right. But the opposite risk, always hiring somebody who will do well, the best way to do that, if that's your only goal, is to hire everybody, right? So these are
Sure.
two
Of course.
polar
But that's
opposite ways to measure accuracy. And ultimately, when people think about what accuracy means, they think about ways of, imposing these, let's say, thresholds on the certainty that your
yep.
predictor makes so as to balance the false positives and the false negatives.
So I guess I'm going to put the point. This might be too coarsely, but I'm just going to put it rather coarsely, and you tell me what's wrong with it. Look, when it comes to something like hiring, and maybe other things as well, there's just so much uncertainty. There's just so many places where you can put the threshold. There's different ways of creating that model that, for all you know, are equally good with regards to accuracy or something along those lines, performance, let's just say. And so, in the light of that ignorance, non culpable ignorance about which way to design the model such that it would be maximally, performing maximally well, let's put in some other kinds of considerations. So, if you've got 10 different ways of designing the model, I'm including here things like choosing the threshold, weighting the variables, whatever. You're choosing all these different ways to design the model. You don't really have good grounds for thinking that one of those 10 ways is better than any of the others in terms of performance. Why not choose the seventh way, model number seven, design number seven, because design method number seven is going to incorporate some other kind of thing that we care about, like diversity or something along those lines. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I think you have that right. So what you're talking about is what we refer to in the technical community as model multiplicity, or essentially what are all the different ways, all the different criteria of evaluation of a model, of the goodness of the model, or, safety of the model
Sure, yeah.
that we may take into account when deciding which model to pick. And, these models, they are engineering artifacts and they are built to some specification. There's something that they presumably optimize. And so because there is a specification that goes into the design of these models, we can certainly validate them against how well they meet that particular specification or a bunch of other related specifications. And then we can pick how well our model does based on these criteria. But one thing that we should always keep in mind is that there's always a very simple way to build a model. And that way would be to filter out all the job applicants who clearly don't meet the requirements for the job, right? So for example, you're requiring that somebody has a degree in a particular field of study,
Sure.
and they have a certain number of years of experience. So you take the set of people who meet all of these very clearly specified criteria, and from among that set, you can just pick a random subset. And if you had some additional diversity requirements, let's say based on where the people come from geographically, or what gender or age group they represent, you could very simply embed into your sampling procedure these requirements. And what I'm not seeing in the industry today is folks evaluating and comparing the performance of their fancy AI-based
Hmm.
models to the performance of this very simple procedure that I just described, right? And
Hmm.
another advantage of this procedure is that it's fair in the sense that everybody is treated by the same process, that there's nothing hidden there. We can really explain how this process unfolds, right? And the third very important criterion here, or very important property, is that this process is cheap to implement. You don't have to pay a vendor who is selling you a fancy, expensive AI model for something that they very often can't even show does better than this simple, criteria and then random choice procedure.
So, okay, so this is for hiring in particular, this random choice thing. So this is random choice among the set of people or applications that meet some minimal threshold.
Minimal or maximal or whatever threshold that you feel strongly about as
Sure,
a business,
sure,
right?
yeah,
And let
yeah,
me
yeah,
actually give you another, before we kind of talk more deeply about this, another reason why this is a good model and a good process is because it doesn't assume that people are somehow ready-made good employees. That whenever you have somebody who joins your company and who has the appropriate qualifications as determined
yeah.
by this threshold, then it's up to the company to make sure that the environment is created in such a way that the person grows professionally and that they fit within the company's culture and move that culture forward, right? So this gives agency and control back to the company and back to the employee who was hired to develop together.
Yeah, okay, so I can see how this makes a lot of sense if you're talking about a hiring situation. And to put it more generally, in any case in which you're dealing with something like candidates about whom you are deeply ignorant, really, or it's hard to figure out, or it's impossible to figure out, given the available evidence, the likelihood that someone's going to be really good. And so you have these qualifications, and once they meet these qualifications, you engage in sort of random picking that's going to be compatible with, say, diversity goals, whatever it is. But suppose we're not making, let's take a different kind of model, like mortgage applications, about which we seem to have more data. We don't really have good data, and your colleagues informed me of this. We don't have good data in the HR space about, hey, we hired this person. Did they turn out to do really well? We don't really track that. Or they might have been hired for reason X and they're doing really well, but it's for reason Y, not why they were hired. And so we don't have, I can see how it sounds like the hiring world is just a sort of mess when it comes to data, or it's
Or
less of a mess.
evaluation
It's an app, right?
or
Yeah.
evaluation criteria, right? I mean, that's one of the
Yes.
biggest messes there is that you can't really tell whether somebody in fact is doing well.
Right. Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, completely. But now let's go to something like mortgage applications where there's tons of data about here's the people that we lended to, here's what their portfolio was, here's the rates at which they defaulted or paid late or paid early, et cetera. There's lots of data there. And so there's not this sort of, there's not this level of ignorance, whereas you would think something like, and or tell me I'm wrong though. You would think, okay, before I said, look, there's 10 different models, model multiplicity, as you said, in the HR space. And that's because among these 10 models, we don't really have any grounds on which to conclude that one model is performing better than the other, more accurate than any other or whatever. And so given that, we can choose the one that is compatible with other sorts of goals. But I imagine in the mortgage space or some similar kind of space where we have lots of data where ignorance isn't the problem, we don't have 10 different models. We have
So,
the one. Yeah, so push back. And I hear you already pushing back. The model multiplicity issue is just ignorance about performance. Whereas in space where we have lots of data, therefore we have lots of knowledge. And so we don't have model multiplicity. We have the model that performs the best. And now there's no room for incorporating other goals like diversity or whatever it is.
yeah, so I think model multiplicity comes up essentially in every domain. Even if we had perfect data about how the world is today, it would still not include information about what people's day-to-day lives are other than what these candidate applications or mortgage loan applications capture. It doesn't have information about how the world and the economic situation in society is going to develop going forward, right? So there is always something outside the system that is not
Mm.
knowable. But even if we had all of the data available to us, and this was only and all of the data that is relevant for decision making, still under the assumption that we will sometimes mispredict, you cannot fully reconcile goals that are even as simple as lowering the false positive rates and lowering the false negative rates. And the reason for this is because ultimately there are different stakeholders, different people and different groups who care more strongly about particular aspects of performance, right? So for somebody, for example, who is really hungry for an opportunity to prove themselves, but they don't look good on paper, right? For them, it's really important to not become a false negative. They really want to make it into that set of people that are being screened in, that are
Sure.
being hired, so that they can prove themselves. For the company, who knows? I mean, this may be a goal, but maybe the goal that they state instead is that there's an urgent task to be done, and they really feel very strongly about getting only the people who they know will do well. And
Sure.
even if they lose some people who are these false negatives, right, maybe they don't care as much about that. And then diversity is yet another set of goals, right? And where that comes in part, is because the data does not reflect people's abilities in an equal way somehow, in a comparable way in the data. Because when somebody presents as a job applicant, or a college applicant, or a loan applicant, and there's a particular component of their profile based on which you're going to score them, that component may just look different, and it may reflect better access to, as we say, developmental opportunity, or better access to generational wealth,
Sure.
right, in
Sure.
the case of lending, than for somebody else,
So, okay, so there's a lot. That was a
right?
lot. So, one point I think you made is something like, "Look, we're always gonna be more or less steeped in ignorance." It's just if nothing else, we're steeped in ignorance about how the future will unfold, and so that's going to create certain kinds of ambiguities about which model is appropriate, given that the model is gonna be used in this future about which we are ignorant. So I think that's one of the points. Another point is you've got different stakeholders who are going to prefer different models for different reasons.
Right.
Now, that seems totally true, but now I'm thinking again about, you know, this data scientist or team of data scientists working at some Fortune 500 company, and they really just have to answer to, one might think, anyway, they just have to answer to one stakeholder, and that's their boss or their boss's boss or something like that. And so, while it's true that there is model multiplicity, they have very clear marching orders on the criteria by which they choose a model. Specifically, choose the one that maximizes the bottom line, roughly, something like that. And so, I agree that in principle, there's this multiplicity of models. I mean, not even in principle, in practice, there's a multiplicity of models, but that while a data scientist or a team of data scientists may recognize those different stakeholders, may recognize that those different stakeholders have different interests and thus would choose model 3 versus model 7, while the other would choose 7 instead of 3, there's not really the room in, say, a corporate environment to choose the one that represents the stakeholder interests of the ones that are not the interests of the bosses.
Yeah, and this is where I'm talking about social sustainability once again, right?
Mhm.
Bosses can have different types of interests. They can have interests that are to maximize the bottom line today, given the information that we have today. Or they may be more forward looking, and they may be interested also in making sure that their company is seen in a good light, so that they're able to get better data scientists to join their team, people who actually care about social responsibility, and so that they're
Sure.
able to attract customers because their product is, organic and sustainable and inclusive. So
Sure, sure.
there are
Yeah, yeah.
also these market forces and societal forces that ultimately reflect in the bottom line, not necessarily today, but maybe, tomorrow or the day after. So
Yeah.
it's this sustainability over time.
Well, so
There, yeah,
let me
yeah,
let me push you on that point though. I mean, I think that sounds exactly right. Different stakeholders within a given organization are going to have different things. I mean, different priorities, different interests, different concerns. And that's true in a single product team, in a single executive team, right? Different members of the C-suite. One can be a bleeding heart, one can be a, greedy Wall Street, whatever. And so you're not going to have internal alignment on which stakeholders are most important and why. You're not going to get that. But then you've got this sort of pragmatic issue of, look, we got to build an AI ethics or responsible AI program at our massive corporation with, it's all over the place. We need to give marching orders to our teams. Now, is it something like we'll just let a thousand flowers bloom and different people will choose different models based on the interests or the concerns or the beliefs of different product managers and data scientists, and so different models will reflect different stakeholder interests? Or do you think there has to be something like, listen, everyone, get on the same page. This is how we choose models across the enterprise.
So whatever that you do, I think that ultimately we should start not with are we maximizing false positive rates or false negative rates, or
Sure, sure.
are we quantifying accuracy in this particular way or this other way more generally, right? But rather what companies should start with, and I think that many of them already do, is with articulating what are their principles and what are their values, right? What is the principle of operation? And then you choose technical solutions, you establish what the marching orders are in accordance with these principles and with the values. And this is documented in some way, right? So maybe hopefully, there
Sure.
is some internal governance that explains to data scientists that the reason that this is the trade off that we pick, or this is the set of metrics that we prioritize, is because we really need to make sure that we build enough capital so that we can even continue operating, right, over a 5-year
Sure.
horizon. But we are cognizant of the facts that over time, as we, build more capital, that we're going to be able to maybe reevaluate how we prioritize all of these different needs. So what I'm advocating for is not chaos, is not sort of pluralism
Mm.
that is unwieldy, but rather for the management to step back and to think carefully about what it is that they want their products to do and how they want their company to be seen also externally and internally, and then align their technical choices with these very explicitly made value choices.
So then I guess the question is, so yeah, let's suppose a company's got their stated values, whatever they are, by now they're sort of, generic, fairness and transparency and explainability and blah, blah, blah. Fine. Let's even say that they've translated those values into operating procedures whereby they check for, as it were, compliance with or living up to these values at each stage of the AI lifecycle or something along those lines. Still, there's going to be cases in which there's conflict between the principles, or there's conflict between the principles or the values and something straightforward like model accuracy or whatever it is that you're trying uh, else to maximize. And then again, is it something like we'll leave each team to sort of balance these things out? Or is it, listen, hey, teams, step one, get this set of models, a subset of models that, for all you know, are maximally accurate. So you could build 70 models, but instead it's these these 10 that are, for all we know, as good. Each one is as good as the other, no better or worse. And now, I'm sort of thinking about operationally, procedurally. Now, once you've said those 10, now wheel in the values for choosing which among those 10. Is that the procedure?
So I would start with the values, but then also, if you have a model that you have been developing, let's say you are a data science team, and you think that it's as accurate as any other model that you could have developed, this conclusion is based on the training data that you have, which may or
Hmm.
may not, in fact, be reflective of how your model performs in production, and
Yeah.
it may or may not be reflective of how your model performs over time, right? So there are tools that are at our disposal, like A/B testing, right? Where we
Hmm.
test out this model and another. And we may be testing another model, even if it does not perform at the very top in terms of a particular accuracy metric while we have it in development. But it may turn out to be the case that when the model is live, when it's in production, that it performs comparably
Yeah,
and
things go
is
sideways.
also
Yeah.
allowing us to be, more cognizant, let's say, of some of the diversity requirements that we may
Yeah.
want to
Yeah.
have. So just not trusting your test environment, I think, fully, and also coupling that with a rigorous means of evaluation, I think is a very good way forward. And then another thing you said was, who decides, right? So
Hmm.
I do think that we need to have a distributed accountability structure at organizations, including, of course, commercial companies, right? So it's not going to ever be the case that a single decision maker at the top of the company can competently and confidently make all decisions throughout the development and deployment and evaluation stack.
Sure. Yeah.
They don't have enough time, they don't have enough expertise, they're not as close to the model development as a data scientist will be. So I think that it's very important that we have appropriate levels of training, appropriate levels of responsibility and accountability that we assign to each of these roles, and an opportunity for people in these roles to talk to each other to see how well they are, in fact, able to carry that responsibility.
Yeah. Let me ask you a stupid question. My stupid question is, all right. I mean, yeah, you're really selling me on the inadequacy of these models to sort of be accurate or to be, the right one. You know, this is me putting my sort of non-technologist. I mean, I don't have to put my non-technologist hat on. I am a non-technologist, but really trying to sort of push a sort of skeptical route of saying something like, yeah, why are we even using AI then? If it's so uncertain as to what model we're supposed to pick because we're so steeped in ignorance. And, why do we need it? Like for the HR stuff, we make sure that they pass some certain filter. And after that, we choose randomly. That's not AI. So is, I guess the question is something like, given that, when should we use AI or when would it be irresponsible to use AI? Something along those lines.
I love your question, Reed. And I'm absolutely with you on this, meaning that if we can't tell what we expect this AI to do for us, and if we can't tell whether it's meeting these requirements that we've set out for it, then there's no reason at all to use it, right?
Mm.
Because what you're doing is essentially looking at a crystal ball, crossing your fingers and hoping that it's going to give you the answer that somehow is going to be the right one, right? And very often people, I mean, choice is paralyzing, right? I mean, this is in everyday life, what movie to watch, what food to eat,
Yeah.
as well as when you have to choose an employee for a company and you are an HR person. So whatever shortcut we can get, in helping us choose without having to kind of be inefficient in this choice, we take that, right? I mean, this is something that people do to speed
So
things
yeah.
up.
So AI is the emotional crutch.
Yeah, I think so, right? But
Yeah.
you said, why should we be using AI? It depends on how you define AI also. So to me, a system that matches people based on their resumes to the very clearly specified criteria and requirements for a job can be quite sophisticated, right? And this can also be considered an AI system. So, for
Hmm.
example,
Hmm.
a company uses a particular vocabulary to describe the requirements for the job. Your resume uses a slightly different vocabulary. There's going to be a method somewhere that has been trained on data, has been validated to say that, if the company is looking for people who can drive a truck, and you were in the military and you were driving a tank, then it may be the case that you, in fact, are qualified for this
Sure.
job to drive a truck,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So these are AI systems, and we can use them if we can tell exactly what we expect them to do for us, if we can check that they are meeting that specification, and very importantly, if we can rely on these systems to help a human decide rather than take over the decision-making process fully.
So can you spell that out a little bit more? So, I mean, there's a way in which it's a very high bar to reach. Use the AI on the condition that you can, it's something like to put it at the very abstract level, sufficiently test it. Make sure that you know it's sufficiently reliable. What does that even look like? I mean, usually, especially now with generative AI or LLMs in particular, the quantity of use cases is so massive and varied. What does it look like to test something like to test for reliability or to test for it's going to behave the way that we think it's going to behave? How do you ever know that?
This is a great question. How do we test these AI systems? How do we know that they are reliable? And here I think is where we need to really start thinking example by example and thinking back to history and thinking about domains where we have been using technology successfully after a lot of trial and error and rinse and repeat. So we have cars that we drive. And when cars first came out, they were deadly machines, right? There were no rules of the road. People were not required to get a driver's license to drive them. There were no seat
Right, right.
belts. And then there were seat belts that they only worked for men because that's who people tested them on, right? So
Sure.
I think that we need to go through the same exercise with the use of AI, but not in general, but rather specifically domain by domain. Here's what is required for us to certify that an AI can be used responsibly in hiring. Here's what's required for
Yeah.
us to certify that an AI can be used responsibly in the clinical practice, right?
Yeah.
And it's hard. Yeah.
I agree. I mean, so, one thing that really interests me is the use of large language models in diagnostic settings for, in healthcare. But there's no such thing, I don't think, as a benchmark for sufficiently safe to be deployed in healthcare because it's going to depend, right? It's going to depend upon is it sufficiently safe to be deployed for oncology, for endocrinology, for pediatric. I mean, there's so many subspecialties, and then there's so many variants so much varies between that. Maybe it's amazing at oncology for white people aged 40 to 75, but it's really bad at, say, not white people or kids. But you're not going to know to do that unless you first take the LLM, put it in the oncology setting, and then put it in something like a sufficiently robust or diverse set of circumstances to test. But that's like, a decades long process. I mean, how do you ever do that? How do you even split up? How do you even begin to split up the use cases such that you think, yeah, this is good for oncology everywhere now? Any oncology thing, black, white, Asian, Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, whatever, young, old, oncology, it's got it down. Right? How do you even get to that point? Is that possible?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't think that it's going to be possible because the starting point for this sort of a deliberation, right, that we're having in society today is that, for example, large language models, right, and other types of generative AI, but let's just say large language models, that they are given to us, they exist. They were designed however they were designed.
Yeah.
And there are some things that they just are not designed for. For example, an LLM, when it utters a sentence, or suggests a diagnosis, it does not tell you based on what it uttered that sentence. It does not
Yeah.
have the ability to corroborate, to explain the evidence, right? And this is a design choice that was made because really LLMs in particular, they were made with a single goal, and that is to sound like a human.
Yep.
And that's
Yep.
very different from the goal of a clinician. I mean, would you go to a clinician who sounds like a clinician? No. I would go to a clinician who maybe, isn't very eloquent even, but is able to demonstrate to me that they know what they're talking
Yeah.
about, right?
The
It's
grounds
just
on which they give their advice.
right. And so I just don't think that in the current kind of state and where we are in the development of this technology can be used responsibly in critical domains.
Yeah.
It can be used to write science fiction stories in
Sure,
the
sure, sure.
style of a 1930s Chicago gangster. I mean, that's really awesome how it does that, but I wouldn't want it to be diagnosing me. And I feel like it's even problematic even if we have clinicians at the table because they don't have information about based on what this machine is making the suggestions. It's very hard for people to challenge these suggestions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually worse than that because they give explanations. If you say, "Why did you give that diagnosis?" the LLM will spit out a purported explanation, but it's illusory, right? It's not whatever thing it says in response to the question or the prompt. Why did you give me that diagnosis? Those are not the grounds on which or the reasons for which it gave the advice or the diagnosis because it's not the kind of thing that gives advice for reasons. It's not a reasoning machine. And so not only is it false, but it's illusory because the unsuspecting user will be like, oh, yeah, it just gave me the reasons for why it gave me that diagnosis when it did no such thing because it can't, because it doesn't give outputs for reasons.
And that's an excellent point that you're making, right? Is that it's trying to essentially mislead us into trusting the system. And
Yeah.
we really should not be in this environment because now the cost of figuring out whether these tools are legally compliant or even not nonsensical, right?
Yeah.
The cost is now put on the user rather than on the people who came up with this technology. And that's one of these examples where unless we have these responsibility concerns built into the design of the systems, there's just no way to fix them post factum.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So again, I'll push back. I think it's devil's advocate. I can't tell whether I'm the
that's
actual
good.
devil or not.
Yeah.
There are these examples in which LLMs in a diagnostic setting do amazing things. They seem to actually output information that doctors find very helpful. There's one example, and maybe the pushback, maybe the problem is too anecdotal, but there's one example that was in the newspaper, I don't know, a month or two ago, where a mother couldn't find, they couldn't figure out what was wrong with her son for like 14 years or something. And one night she started consulting an LLM. I think it was GPT 4.0, and prompts and prompts and prompts and questions until she landed on something that she thought, oh, actually, I think this is right. Took it to the doctors and yada, yada. Turns out it was right. And finally, after 14 years, he gets the right diagnosis. The son gets the right diagnosis, but it was because of this interact with the LLM. So, I mean, that's kind of, provided it's all true, incredible. There's other researchers, I'm thinking in particular of Peter Lee at Microsoft, wrote this book with some others about these kinds of things. I don't know. So if we say if we take the stance that you take and that I'm at least not disinclined to take, yeah, the benchmarks for safety are too. It's a moving target. It's not clear what the use cases are. It's not clear what constitutes safe deployment, given the variety of cases, the quantity of cases in which the thing can be deployed, et cetera, et cetera. But I guess the worry is that for for due to some kind of fear, we are failing to take advantage of an amazing technology that could save lots of lives.
That's a great point, and it is in fact irresponsible to not use technology, to not, just like it would be irresponsible to not treat somebody, right, if there is treatment available. So when we do randomized controlled trials for medicine, if people are assigned to the placebo group, but then it's determined that the treatment group actually gives life-saving interventions, there is an
Yeah.
ethical responsibility to give the treatment also to the
Yeah.
placebo group, right? So absolutely, we should not be holding back on using methods, including also technical methods that can save lives. But in this case, though, just once again to push back, I'm very skeptical about ChatGPT in this case producing a novel diagnosis. I think that rather than seeing this as a success of LLMs, I would see this as a failure of the medical system to not have diagnosed the child, right? Because ultimately the LLM doesn't find anything new. It correlates and
Ye-
regurgitates known information.
ye-
So why
So,
wasn't there a doctor that was able to diagnose?
so what do I? So suppose look, it's both. I mean, it's both a success of the LLM and a failure of the medical
Hmm.
system. And then I say something like, well, two things. One, we've got the medical system that we do, and while reform and improvement is wonderful, it's decades, decades in the making, even if you've got the resources behind it to affect that kind of change, including the political will to do it, which is a tall order. But suppose we even get that. The other thing to say is something like, aside from a failure of the medical system, it's just the limits of the human mind. Right? So someone trains their whole life and they're an amazing oncologist, but they're a really bad pediatrician or an endocrinologist because medical knowledge is so specialized and you can't get pragmatically, a team of 75 doctors on every single case. And so you're going to have, the one person, you're going to have your doctor who has got their specialty. They're not a geneticist. They're not an endocrinologist. They're not whatever it is. And so, yes, the LLM is sort of regurgitating information in some sense or other, but it's also doing it in a way that humans can't because we don't have all that info in our head to synthesize and output in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, and I agree that it can be a useful device, just like in the hiring domain, just to return to that for 1 second, right?
Yeah.
We talked about there being a useful AI potentially that can match people's resumes with positions, even if it's not immediately obvious. So
Yeah.
I could see a regime where we use these systems to help actual human doctors diagnose a difficult patient, but only if they're able to then point to references, right? And then another thing I'll say is this: we don't judge how good a doctor is based on the cases that they have diagnosed successfully, right? We judge them based on how many times they messed up.
Sure. Yeah.
So just think, there's a doctor you go to, they were able to once solve a really difficult case, but then they
Yeah.
killed 99 patients.
Right. Right.
I
Right.
I
Right.
think that's kind of where we are, right? And then
Yeah.
the example that got picked up was this positive one because it differs.
I think we got to wrap up in a minute, but I sort of think what this conversation crystallizes is that the appropriateness and responsible use of AI is deeply use case specific.
Indeed.
Whether we know enough to use this thing, whether it's a plausible solution to our problem, what's the benchmark for sufficiently safe for deployment for this particular use case, and which means that a tremendous amount of thought has to go into each and every use case. And then you could sort of say there's going to be very broad criteria for what constitutes safe deployment or what would constitute a good test for reliability or something along those lines. But getting specific on what the test is going to be for this particular model, for this particular use case, that takes a lot of work. And so then the challenge, especially for a large organization, is something like how do we scale how do we scale something like the efficient and effective inquiry every time for every use case, especially when they want to deploy, first dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of models. It feels like a pretty big lift for a company to do.
Indeed. And I think that here we are striving for efficiency that maybe is not within reach. that
Mhm.
we should just contain ourselves and control how much we do and how quickly we do these
Yeah.
things, right? It's better to do fewer things well than to try cover a lot of ground, but then you really are uncertain about what the outcomes may be. And then another thing here is that there's just we as humans, we are conditioned to believe what we see, right? So you can't unsee what you've seen. And we're conditioned to attribute culture and intelligence and reasoning to something that sounds like human language, right? And this is a huge, huge challenge with AI, is that it's successfully fooling us deliberately into thinking that there's a human on the other end
No.
of the line, right? And so we really need to just reflect and use our own common sense, even if it was a human on the other end of the line, given the information that they have. Could they have known, for example, what disease this is? Was it just a lucky guess?
Sure.
And if
Sure.
something common sense wise just sounds like it couldn't be done, it probably can't be done.
Yeah, I'm not sure that common sense is sufficiently distributed for me to feel comfortable with that.
Yeah, but I mean, it's one of the things, right, that we should check
Yeah,
against, I
yeah, yeah.
think.
One last thing I wanna highlight, and is that what you said is efficiency might not be within reach, which is interesting. I mean, because a lot of people in the sort of AI ethics space will say, "No, there's no conflict between ethics and innovation or ethics and speed. In fact, it's like the brakes of a car, it lets you move faster." And I've always thought that's a bit ridiculous because if you're gonna be responsible, you're gonna have to do your due diligence. That's a process, and that takes time. There's just no way of getting around that fact, and I think I hear you saying the same thing. If you wanna do it responsibly, if you wanna do it well, then, maximally efficient is just not a goal that's within reach.
And that I think that that's true for technology and also everywhere else, right? I mean, a very efficient form of government is a dictatorship. But we have decided that
Yeah,
we want to spend time
I
on,
like that.
having a democracy and doing elections and campaigning and
Yeah,
having
yeah.
public deliberations. It's not for efficiency that we do
Uh,
this, but because it's just the right thing to do.
that's a great point.
Yeah.
An efficient form of government is a dictatorship.
And an
That
efficient kind
encapsulates a
of a
lot.
company is a monopoly. And yet it's the right thing to break up monopolies, right? Because they
Yeah, yeah,
disadvantage everybody else, people and other companies and just everybody. So
yeah.
it's, yeah.
Julie, this has been awesome. Thanks so much for the chat.
Thank you very much, Reed. Awesome for me as well. It wasn't a meeting, it was a fun conversation. So
Oh, good, good.
it
I'm
lived
glad.
up to that that goal.
That was the goal.
Yeah.
Good,
Yeah.
awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you.